So my name is Angelika Tamasova and I represent the European Environment Agency here today. I would like to thank the organizers for the kind invite. I'm very happy to be here today with you at this regional workshop. Yes. So this is my first slide. It's about the European Environment Agency. The headquarters are in Copenhagen, in Denmark. And well, just to say a few words about who we are an EU agency. We provide knowledge and we provide data for policy processes. What we do is that we are in charge of robust reporting structures, and this is how we collect data from the EU member states and from the EEA member countries, often on a voluntary basis. We prepare policy analyses, and those policy analyses prepared by the NGOs feed into the EU policy-making processes. We also have our own knowledge network that's called the IONET, and we intensely liaise with more than 400 institutions across Europe. We also coordinate and cooperate a lot with the European Commission, with the European Parliament and all the EU member states. And so now I would like to dive into the topic of my today's presentation. You have heard already a lot about what's going on at the European level in terms of strategy and planning. You already provided your country reports, which was very interesting for me to listen in and see where you are with your adaptation planning processes. And now in my presentation today, I would like to paint you the European picture in terms of adaptation. So where we are, what's happening in Europe. The EEA published at the end of the last year in 2022 an assessment report with the title Advancing Towards Climate Resilience. And that report basically showcases how the EU member states and Turkey are moving in the adaptation policy process and how they try to address the question of climate resilience. The assessment report is based on the information what was reported in 2021 under the governance regulation, and it's going to be soon updated, at least the key messages, because in 2023 we also have a reporting year that was already mentioned by my colleagues, that the deadline was 15th of March. So we have right now the fresh and new information in, but we haven't done the assessment yet. And so in this report, basically we try to have a look at the situation, but I would like to just flag that it's different what was reported by the member states, and sometimes it's slightly different from the reality, from the real situation, but this report is based on the official governmental information communicated towards us, and also on the long-term EEA work at this field, at monitoring and reporting and evaluating national adaptation strategies and plans. And maybe I will take this slide also from here, because we have already had a discussion and you have seen the adaptation support tool or the policy cycle already in 2 presentations. And Michael also outlined the steps of the adaptation policy making, policy processes. So, well, you can find this tool on the already mentioned Climate Adapt. It's an interactive tool, so if you visit it, there is a hyperlink in my presentation. So after it will be distributed, you can check yourself. You can click through the different stages from 1 to 6. These were also already mentioned. And you can find a kind of a guidance or an explanation. You are adaptation experts, you are policymakers, practitioners. So if you need like kind of backup information and guidance, you can go there and check what's going on. You can find the best practice and the case studies on the climate adapt, so you can get an inspiration from other countries, what they are doing. So that's on the planning side and on the guidance side. We hope that the European Commission's guidelines on national adaptation strategies will follow the same approach. We have also an approach for the urban practitioners, that's called the Urban Adaptation Support Tool, and under the mission on adaptation, there will be a guidance for regional practitioners. So it's getting quite robust. But on the other hand, the reported information can be structured also around this policy cycle. And those are basically the key storylines of the report I'm going to present to you soon. And so we will look at each step, at each topic, and I will tell you what we have figured out from the information reported to us. And I will take the next slide from my chair. I hope you can still hear me. So, as I mentioned, we have the climate-related hazards and vulnerabilities and risk as the second step of the AST. And here you can see the key messages from the report. So what we can see from Europe is that basically all the planning and the decision making in climate change adaptation is based on robust climate risk analysis. There are different types. Countries are moving towards the multi-sectoral risk assessments, but quite frequent are the sector-based or the thematically focused studies in scope. Of course, you should update your climate risk assessment on a regular basis, and the updates should support your adaptation policy. That's also how is it in the adaptation support tool outlined, and we see that countries are aiming to do that, but the updates are not as frequent as we would say. And so this kind of principle applying in practice, that's rather the exception than the rule. And when we look at those analyses, a few sectors are quite often addressed, and those are the health, agriculture and food, forestry, water management, biodiversity. On this slide, you can see the one of the elements of the reporting, and that's reporting on the observed climate hazards. There are two types reported, the acute and the chronic hazards. And as you see, the countries or the EU member states reporting, they reported as the most serious hazards the droughts, the heat waves, the changing temperature, flood, and heavy precipitation. In this next slide, I try to prepare an overview of the key affected sectors reported. And today, when I was listening to your presentations, I saw that the overlap is quite significant because also the countries in the EU struggle with addressing the same sectors under climate change adaptation. So those sectors are the health, you already mentioned health today a lot, forestry, agriculture and food, biodiversity, water management, and transport. And here on these slides, you can see actually two infographics. One is on the key affected sectors reported, how the country perceived, and the other is like a geographic analysis coming from the adaptation strategies of the countries. We looked at the objectives and the adaptation goals and try to see what kind of sectors are mentioned there. And we see how clearly these two align. And I would say we have a challenge here. A much more like broader challenge because you are trying to address those sectors in your policies as well. And so just to conclude on the climate-related hazards, vulnerabilities and risk, three short key messages is that the first one is all these assessments are most of the time coordinated centrally by the government, and the assessments are elaborated because there is a need for them in the adaptation planning procedure. All the countries rely heavily on the domestic research capacities and on the national research programs. So here really they try to use what they have in the country. Sometimes we see also international projects, consortia reported, but most of the time it's always kind of like domestic research and projects. And of course, we have gaps. We have many gaps in climate change adaptation and challenges. And under the climate risk assessments, those are the questions: how to address the presence of the non-climatic factors, how to address the cross-border risk, how to address the more complex risks what can influence our policies. And now I would like to move on the adaptation policies and priorities. Here we have looked at the type of the policy documents the EU member states have. And what we saw is that actually, and it's a quite important point, the kind of the setting a country has always reflects the special national circumstances of the country. It would be quite challenging to compare the German approach with the Maltese, right? Because the countries are just so different. So how the national adaptation policy frameworks actually evolved, that really reflects on the country's governance and institutional setting. I will show you an infographic on this later, my next slide. The other things we spotted is that usually most of the adaptation policies are soft. They are not legally binding, but they are rather like soft and non-hierarchical approaches. But many member states started to shift from the soft approaches towards more legally binding approaches, and they have started to elaborate and adopt climate laws, addressing also adaptation. In terms of the adaptation measures, the no-regret and the soft measures are the most common, trying to address the knowledge gaps, awareness raising, and the lack of the management capacity. And last but not least, one dimension is a new dimension. It's the social justice dimension, or the just resilience agenda, which is not yet incorporated to the country's policy documents, but some of them have already addressed them, and there is a big discussion ongoing how to approach the most vulnerable and how to take them on board. And so this is the infographics I mentioned previously. Basically, here we really try to capture the progress from 2005 until this day. And soon we are going to update this because, as you see, we have information from 2022, and right now we are elaborating the assessment and update 2023. And in terms of the colors, so here you can see not just the EU member states, but also the EEA member countries, what means also Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Turkey. And kind of you can see the shift in the adaptation policies from something initial as a national adaptation strategy to something towards like a very complex system where a country can have a strategy, an action plan, a sectoral adaptation strategy, regional adaptation strategies, and all this kind of combination of the documents. Some countries have only a plan, which is a complex climate change plan addressing both mitigation, adaptation, and communication strategies. Here you can really see, based on the color coding, how countries are moving towards more complex kind of settings, how many times they actually evaluated their strategies and updated them. Those are the little stars or asterisks in the boxes. And what we can see is that one country out of the 3 EEA countries at least did once an evaluation process with an update of the strategy. So there is a really movement in the policy frameworks. Briefly on adaptation governance. So how the institutional arrangements look like in the EU member states. We can say that they are at place, they are functional. There is a very intense coordination and networking going on, both in terms of sectoral coordination and mainstreaming adaptation agenda to the priority sectors. And also it's very intense in terms of the vertical coordination, so discussing or bridging the national, the regional, and the local levels of adaptation. On subnational adaptation, we see that those policies are also soft and based on bottom-up approaches and recommendations. Only a few countries have something binding for the subnational level. And 3 more messages on the adaptation governance. One thing to mention is the cross-border and the transboundary cooperation. That was also set up and is working very well. As you know, climate change doesn't know borders, so we need to talk to each other and we need to go to projects together to address those cross-border impacts, for example. And there are many macro-regional strategies in Europe on this, for example, the Danube strategy or the Carpathian Convention, where countries together try to address climate change adaptation. And the last 2 points on the governance are the already mentioned vulnerable groups or most vulnerable groups in light of the just resilience agenda. So they are usually involved in the consultation processes as key stakeholders, and we really expect that their voice will only grow in the future. We also mentioned the private sector involvement today. So countries also report on the private sector, but here I would like to maybe mention that it's very hard to track the activities of the private sector, both in terms of financing and projects. But what we see that there are common cooperation on under the frame of the public-private partnerships, and they are addressing capacity building. They try to provide information, and they are usually functional at the subnational level. And now I would like to go from my perspective to the most interesting storyline, and that's on implementation and financing, because we all want to know where we are. We all want to see the progress as we are approaching towards climate resilience. So what can we see from the reported information? In terms of implementation, mainstreaming is ongoing into the sectoral policies, into the regulatory frameworks. Mainstreaming is ongoing in agriculture, in urban policies, in water, in disaster risk management, and it's addressed under the Sustainable Development Agenda. Also, climate change adaptation is mainstream to the environmental impact assessment procedures, but the strategic environmental assessment procedure lags behind a bit. And from what we have seen about the adaptation measures, what kind of measures are the most implemented or reported measures? Well, they are usually on the soft side, as I already mentioned, addressing adaptive capacity, addressing awareness raising, addressing education, training, strategic project implementation, and they are oriented towards the regional and the local level very often. And well, in terms of finances and budgets, what we have seen was quite surprising, but actually quite many action plans or sectoral plans just don't have dedicated budgets, which is, we all know money is an enabling factor and it's very hard to implement something without financial backup. Here you can see a slide on the key types of measures. So that's another kind of tool we use. This information is coming only from the voluntary part of the reporting, and 10 EU member states reported on the types of the measures they report. We have 5 categories of the measures, and we have also subcategories. But as you can see from this graph, management and planning was very frequently reported, and that aligns to the message on the governance, what's working, and also on the institutional setup, because all these things were set up and are operational. And well, I already mentioned information and awareness raising, capacity building, lifestyle practices. Those were the most reported adaptation measures. And the last 2 messages on the implementation and the financing. So, well, what we have seen is that it's very hard to track finance, both public and private, spent on adaptation. The European member states very frequently use the EU mechanisms to fund their initiatives. We also see that, of course, they have backup from public finance, but we cannot tell the numbers because there is no common methodology on how to assess this. They also sometimes report financial infrastructure and architecture, and sometimes they report numbers. So it's very hard to come to a conclusion, and we definitely need to improve this in the future. And well, I already mentioned that only a few member states reported that they have something dedicated, like a dedicated national adaptation fund to back up those plans. We already discussed today monitoring, reporting, and evaluation. You also mentioned that you are kind of elaborating a system how to track your progress. So what we have seen from the EU member states is that basically they use MRE for 3 purposes. They would like to better understand how they implemented their adaptation policy and the success of it. They would like to identify new climate risks and vulnerabilities, or maybe revisit like the old ones and try to see the progress if they manage to address, for example, the vulnerability. And they also try to measure the effectiveness of the policy in reducing climate change impacts, risks, and vulnerabilities. In terms of approaches, we are united in diversity, I would say, because we see everything, combining qualitative, quantitative, data coming in from monitoring, different kind of proxies, different kind of criteria, tracking the different measures anchored in the national adaptation plans. So many member states started to use mixed methods. Sometimes we see participatory approaches. I think that was outlined also by Marcus today. Sometimes we see the indicator-based approaches. And the question is how all this feeds back to the adaptation policy cycle, because as soon as we finish with like kind of the evaluation, we have the outcome from our first cycle, and that should be able to somehow support our future planning. We cannot see that right now from the reported information, so we are really excited to read the new country reports and hope to find out more. That's just an illustration on the activities under the monitoring, reporting, and evaluation. As you can see, most of the countries either have some kind of monitoring or are engaging in monitoring and evaluation or are developing a system. And this drives me to the conclusions and future directions. So I try to create some kind of like small hashtags on the main outcomes of the report. And also this paints, I think, the European picture quite well. So I will try to comment on it aligned to the adaptation policy cycle steps. We start with basically preparing for adaptation. And I would say all countries are in EU, all countries have an adaptation strategy or a plan adopted. They adopted it at least once. In terms of risks, the planning is risk informed. In terms of policies, we are moving from soft towards something binding. We are moving also towards implementation, but of course there are many gaps and challenges. We see both top-down and bottom-up approaches, and the countries are really on the way to accelerate their adaptive capacity. And I think I can skip this last slide because all the things have been mentioned by my colleagues before, the EUCRA, the mission adaptation, the governance regulation activities and the reporting, the climate law progress assessment. Those are the things happening right now and will happen in the upcoming years. So we will be very busy. And also in terms of the UNFCCC engagement that was also presented today, how many things are happening under the UNFCCC agenda.